So let's move to the second and final part of our program. Yesterday, Rashad Robinson excited us about going to Capitol Hill with a very powerful phrase that don't mistake presence for power. And that phrase has echoed through these hallways since he said it. The second thing, which we heard our speakers raise many times today, is the phrase that nothing about us without us. And changing the narrative, as we heard, and you may remember I had a phrase that I used in the State of the Field that I actually stole from Gloria Steinem, which was, it's the structure, not the striver. So thank you for that. We are now going to welcome onto the stage two visionary social movement leaders and a visionary journalist. And so let me greet them on. First, DeRay Mckesson, an activist, a trailblazer in the Black Lives Matter movement, the host of the immensely popular Save the People podcast. And I want to talk about an extraordinary piece of symmetry. His new book, On the Other Side of Freedom, The Case for Hope, was just released on Tuesday. And I will say that that was not why we called the plenary The Case for Hope. So were you the right person or what?
Meant to be.
He is joined by Gloria Steinem. She is the most modest icon on the planet Earth. She is a writer, she is an activist, she is a policy wonk, she is an organizer, she is a marcher, and let me just say, previews start October 2nd on Gloria, A Life in New York, which is exactly the show she would create. The first act is theater, the second half is talking circles. And maybe we could add a little lending with that, Jose, what do you think? They will be interviewed and discussed with Tanzina Vega, who's right over there. She's a journalist who has lived the racial wealth divide and has reported on it. She is host of WNYC's The Takeaway and a former CNN Money reporter on race and inequality. Take it away.
Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to The Takeaway. No, I'm kidding. Welcome to the plenary. We really appreciate your being here, and this is super exciting for me with these two guests that we have. So I don't want to waste too much of your time. I think we want to get into questions and hear what these folks really have to say. You know, on our show, when I took over the show a couple months ago, I thought about how we wanted to frame the show and what sort of the ideas were that we would base a lot of our reporting on. And we try to frame our stories with looking at three gaps that exist in American society today. The wealth gap, which you all have been talking about for days, years. The empathy gap, which is really about how we view our fellow humans. Forget about Americans, just our fellow humans. And the truth gap, which I don't think I need to explain. And no, I don't know who wrote the op-ed. So I'd like to ask you both, of those three gaps in American society, should movements be focusing on one versus another? Should we be prioritizing empathy, truth, wealth? Where should we be looking at our movements? What should be the foundation of what we're trying to accomplish today?
No, you first. No, I gotta hear you. I gotta hear you.
Well, I don't think we have to choose, do you? I mean, I think we can focus on all three, but when you said that to me, the first thing I thought of is that I just read that the average American spends 11 hours a day looking at a screen. And the truth of the matter is that what allows us to empathize with each other, the oxytocin, you know, we produce, you know, if somebody, male or female, holds a baby, you're flooded with oxytocin. Or if we see somebody who has had an accident, even if we don't know them, we feel an impulse to, right. The human race probably couldn't survive, right, without oxytocin. Anyway, it only happens when we're together like this, with all five senses. And it's so important, you know, that we have this also in a movement sense, you know, that we're not isolated, that we, once a week, meet, you know, however different we are, we laugh at the same jokes, we tell each other, right? And that's what movements come from, right? Telling your individual truth and discovering you're not crazy, you're not alone. So I would say all those things are equally important, but maybe empathy is a preface to the other two. Would you agree?
And I'd say when I piggyback and say that this is often both and work, not either or work, that has to be the way we think about it. And when I think about the wealth gap, you know, you all are experts in the wealth gap. What I'm always shocked about is how people forget like how we got here, that like the wealth gap sort of just like happened. And I was at this party and blah, 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 and I was wearing it was like a sort of one of those parties, but I went and I'm wearing like this, I'm wearing a like a plastic sort of raincoat that has these 4 facts on it. And one of the facts is that white high school dropouts have more wealth than all black college graduates, right? So it's like a party though, so people are coming up to me and they're like, is that right? And I'm like, that is true, right? And I'll never forget, this guy walks up to me and he's like, well, DeRay, you know the reason that white people have more wealth than black people is that they're more white people. And I was like, in this moment, and I'm like trying to, you know, my thing now is like, I try to deliver the truth as simple as possible. So instead of being like, what did you just say? I was like, yeah, they're more white people because you killed half the people and enslaved the other half, right? And it was this moment about like just being honest about how we got here. Like white people have wealth not because white people worked really hard. It was because we either stole it from other people and gave it to them or just straight up gave it to them, right? And I say that because when we start to think about like solutions, all of a sudden people, when it's about poor people and people of color, people have no imagination. They're like, we couldn't possibly do that. And we're like, we literally gave white people houses. Like we just gave it to them. The highway administration like made the suburbs out of thin air. You know, like we did it for white people. When it comes to people of color and black people, we're suddenly like the most unimaginative people. So that when I think about the wealth gap, sometimes for me, it is really like an imagination gap and how we start to talk about solutions. When I think about the empathy gap, I think about like how we make sure that the other people are doing a lot of work, that too often in this work, we're like morally right. So people say something wild and then you give a speech and then they say no and then you give another speech and they say, I don't know, and then you give another speech. And like they've done nothing and you've done a whole lot of work. And part of this has to be like, how do we actually put the work back on other people? And that I think is like an entrance and like a preface to the empathy. So like I spend a lot of time on police and people ask me all the time, like, are you saying the police should never kill somebody? And I say to them, like, tell me when the police should kill somebody you love. And they're like, I don't know. I'm like, well, I don't know either, right? Like, and part of that is like, how do we share the burden with people? How do we make sure that people actually have to do the work too? And I think about with wealth, it's like, you know, tell me what a 5-year-old has to do to deserve dinner. Like, you know, like, help me understand how like a 10-year-old earns the right to sleep somewhere every night, right? Like, that is like giving other people the work. And then when I think about the truth gap, I'm always mindful that like polarization thrives in extremism. And one of the things that the people we are up against do really well is make everything a battle of extremes. And often our positions are pretty basic, right? So like Colin Kaepernick is literally saying like racism is alive and present. And it's in the criminal justice system, society writ large, and policing. You know, like, that is like a simple truth. And I think part of how I think about the truth gap is we have to start saying our things as like simple as possible. Like every kid should eat dinner. right? Like that's like a basic thing, and like not feeding into this like extreme position that the right tries to like paint us into, but just like talking about it as like simply as possible. Like I believe that the police don't have to kill people. I think we can live in a world where we don't put people in cages and call it rehabilitation, right? Like how do we talk about this as like simply as possible? I think helps us like nail people into the truth.
And we've talked about we talked about empathy and sort of being physically present, which I think is something that's so critical, but technology has also really created Black Lives Matter. It's created a lot of what we're seeing with movement building today, and I think a lot of that is because we can't escape the imagery that's coming through, right? We can't turn away from the videos of Black and brown people being killed by police, of women being harassed, et cetera. Are we beginning to turn a corner and actually have some of that understanding? Are white Americans, are men, for example, saying, I think I get it now. I think I finally understand. And my follow-up to that would be, why is it taking so long to finally understand? Gloria, these are not new issues. You've been involved in movement building for decades, right? Why are we still at this point that feels to me so backward?
Because there is a power structure at work here. I mean, people are people, hello, but we invented race as a concept. It doesn't actually exist. We invented gender as a concept. Actually, we're all unique individuals, and we're all bonded as human beings. So this is deep. And one of the things we haven't done is really look at our past honestly. Both how we obliterated Native Americans, slavery. I mean, I've never been to Germany, but I have the impression that they have done a better job of dealing with their past and instructing kids about it in classrooms and so on than we have. So to see why we have a wealth gap, you have to go back to how we got here. So, I think maybe in movements we go through different stages. I remember thinking, oh, this is so unjust. Surely if I just explain it to people, they will want to do something, right? And then you get past that and you see, wait a minute, this is the whole completely unpaid female labor and underpaid labor to all the groups we know get underpaid. This is the cheap labor on which this whole fucking country has been operating. But I don't want to say, because I love that you start out personally, okay? So that's the important thing. So I don't want to say big things that make you feel like you can't do anything. So, one thing we can do is in New York State at least, we had to pass a law to allow people to tell each other their salaries without getting fired, all right? Our salaries are the one thing we know. If we just tell each other, we will begin to find out what's unfair, right? We can start there. We could start with tax policy, say, and attribute a value at replacement level to caregiving work. I mean, a third of the productive work in the country is raising kids and taking care of, that's in the household usually, and it's not. And make that sum tax deductible if we pay taxes and tax refundable if we don't. I mean, that would be a huge, there are just multitudinous ways, practical ways that we can get there.
I do think too, I'm always interested in, when you first asked the question, I started to think about people's obsession with unconscious bias, like people like obsessed with it. And I'm always like, well, where was the unconscious part, right? Like that, some of that stuff looked real conscious to me. And I say that because I never want to let people like off the hook. Like when the Starbucks incident happened, people were like, they need unconscious bias training. I'm like, that looked real conscious. Like she knew they was black. It's not like she didn't see them being black men. So I say that because like we just, like I'm not convinced about the whole like people don't know thing, right? Like I think a lot more people know, and I think that's like a game. I think the denial is like a choice for a lot of people.
Well, and there's a resistance to wanting to know more, right? As a journalist, I found that there's a definite resistance to the ideas that are coming up today regarding race, regarding unconscious bias is a little bit easier to swallow than saying, well, you're being racist.
Yeah, I don't know if it's like a don't want it. I think people don't want to be labeled and those sort of things, but I'm convinced, again, like the Starbucks thing, I just will never forget being in a conversation. Somebody was like, DeRay, the unconscious bias. I'm like, what was unconscious? I've already seen these black men calling the police. Like, I just like missed the unconscious part of all that. So I think that is one. I do, in as much as Twitter saved our lives, I say that in like no hyperbole. You know, if not for Twitter in St. Louis in August of 2014, Missouri would have tried to convince you that we didn't exist, and like that was real. I've seen the good and bad of social media. The first person ever permanently banned from Twitter was banned for raising money to try and get me killed. So I personally, like, I get it. I've also seen the beautiful parts of Twitter and seen like us able to change a conversation across the country and world. So like that is powerful. A couple things about technology. Some people come to the platform bad, so the platform didn't make them bad, they came bad, right? Like I think that is real.
Not mentioning any names.
Right, you know, there's a lot of people though, like that guy who got banned from, the guy who was the first person banned from Twitter now has White House press credentials, which is like so wild to me. But so some people, he came to the platform bad. And then there are some people that the platform is like radicalizing, right? And I remember we had this meeting with Sheryl Sandberg and said to her, like, what do you do about the Instagram accounts that are white supremacist Instagram accounts and they are private, right? Or like the Facebook private groups that are like supremacist accounts. And she was like, DeRay, we're gonna have AI fix it. And I'm like, when? Like, when is that gonna happen, right? Like how many people have to die for that to happen? Because those platforms have models that are predicated on reporting. And it's like, well, I can't report a private account, but I know that they exist, right? So I do think that there's a question about like what equity and justice looks like in there. And to piggyback off something that Gloria said is like, I do think that we always have to focus on structures, right? That like, I love programs. I used to be a teacher. I worked at Harlem Children's Zone. I opened up an after school program. Like, sign me up for a good program. I like programs. The thing though is that most programs exist because the structure failed in the first place, right? So, and I worry that people get like obsessed with programs and like forget that like if we fix the structure, we should need a million after school programs if we taught kids how to read the first time, right? Like we wouldn't need all those things. And like I think people get like addicted to the program work because the program work is stuff you can touch and feel. When I walked into that, I opened up an after school center. I walked in every day. I had kids from 3 to 8 p.m. If any of you work in after school, 3 to 8 p.m. is a long time after school, but like I could feel it. So every day I went home and it was very different than, I was a chief human capital in the school system and I didn't feel, you know, like I'm managing the healthcare plan for the district. You don't really feel that, right? Like I'm happy people at healthcare, I didn't really feel it. And like I think that people get obsessed with programs and like let the system off the hook. And we can't let the system off the hook. So when I think about the awareness piece, right, like right now I'm obsessed with like how mass incarceration became mass, right? Like how did it actually become that? I'll put you on the spot, Gloria, and ask you to tell me something you can buy for $300. Anything.
Anything. I think I know what's coming, so why don't you just say
No, you tell me that. Tell me something about
Something
that.
you can buy?
You can buy for $300.
Yeah.
A nice pair of shoes.
A nice pair of shoes. So in Florida, to this day, theft over $300 is a felony, and when you become a felon, you permanently lose the right to vote. That's wild, right? And when people think about felons, if you ask like the average person, like who's a felon, they're like somebody who killed 10 people, robbed a bank, and you're like, no, a kid at 18 who stole a pair of shoes, lost the right to vote forever in Florida. Like that is how mass incarceration becomes mass, right? And it's those sort of little pieces that part of our work has to be peeling back those pieces. And I do think that social media allowed us to like tell people unfiltered. There's no more gatekeeper in that work, and I think that's real. The last thing I'll say is that I do worry about people in the nonprofit space give a lot of lip service to the absence of gatekeepers and then they become the gatekeepers, right? So like, you see philanthropists and the program people who really are only giving money to their friends or the people they worked with 15 years ago, right? Like it's like a different version of the good old boys because it's like the nice good old, right? It's like the kind good old boys. It's like the good old boys with the heart. And you're like, that still isn't, like that's not justice either, right? It's just not like, it's not the Koch brothers, but like that still isn't justice, right? And like part of our work can't just be the antithesis of like the worst thing. It actually has to be the like the positive, affirmative version of what we want in the world, and that might be uncomfortable, but I think that that has to be like the honest version.
And the other end of, I mean, we have to think about the corporations that are making money from the prisons and who's investing in those. I mean, you know, there should be no privately owned prison. I mean, it's.
Or today I emailed somebody who is incarcerated on the train right here, and every time I email him, I get annoyed because I have to buy an electronic stamp to send emails. And you're like, I know it don't cost nothing to send this email. Like,
and the phone calls, when you call somebody, I mean, yeah, right. It's absurd, absolutely absurd. I think that New York State has a law against privately owned prisons, so we could do this state by state. It would make a huge difference.
Does change require a belief in the system itself, or that you can actually make the system better, right? Or do you think it's just a willingness to tear it all down? And that's the only way we're going to get past this. Because I think a lot of Americans right now, I don't want to speak for all Americans, are feeling really frustrated with what's going on so many levels, politically, economically, socially, when it comes to healthcare, when it comes to our day-to-day lives. And I think some people are really believing in making this country better within the structures and working within the system. And there are those that say this system is corrupt. We need to just start fresh.
You know, but I remember the phrase false dichotomy from the 60s. Remember that? I think, you know, by any means necessary. You know, we're acting day by day, and I don't think. Somehow I don't think that that's something we should say to ourselves. The question is, what is the most we can do today and tomorrow and tomorrow?
I'm thinking specifically about the Nike ad that came out with Colin Kaepernick, for example. There were people who said this is great, and there were people who said, well, this is just capitalism and corporate America, and we shouldn't, you know, the two things should not be, you know, hand in hand. And I think you can, you know, sort of have that message and also continue to do social justice work, right? But it feels like we're at a point where this ad, for example, will either get lauded or raked over the coals. There is no, nuance when we think about it.
We have to look at the connections. I mean, in a real sense, it was the fact that our media is funded by advertising, not by us or by subscription, that gave us Trump. You know, because he came up through the media, and indeed most candidates now come up through the media, not through a political party. And the reason that his television show, which was really had all the attraction of a roadside accident, you know.
That's real.
And as Les Moonves said, you know, he's bad for the country, but he's good for CBS, just because advertisers buy numbers, not substance, usually. I mean, some advertisers buy some, but usually it's just numbers of viewers, and that's how we got him.
Absolutely.
Right.
And I think about it as like a both and that, you know, I used to work in public schools, and I know a lot of teachers who delivered like amazing lessons for a week and were really bad teachers, right? But they were great for that week, and they did like a dope lesson, and like, so Nike did a dope thing. That doesn't absolve Nike from anything else, right? Like, so happy they did it, like, it is good. It is also, you know, I know Colin, and it is important that like we celebrate people who sacrifice like while they're alive and in the moment, and in that respect, I think that the ad is like really powerful. And the NFL, I don't know if you saw the statement the NFL released. Remember, they haven't said anything really about Colin for a while, and then all of a sudden they're like, we understand Colin. You're like, do you really understand Colin? It took you 2 years to write this little statement on like notes on the iPhone. Like, that was awkward.
I think Ford also came out. There are a couple of advertisers that are coming out in support of this. So it shows how corporate, I think, can move a message, but at the same time, there's this, you know, pushback against him connecting with corporate America in that way.
And what was the original part of the question? Because I feel like there was something before Colin.
Does change require a belief in the
burn
system?
it down, yeah.
Right. Like, do you have to believe that the system itself is workable in order to work in it?
What I would say, I worry about the burn it down makes a lot of sense to me emotionally, because Lord knows, here we are. I think that what I'm always mindful of is that when you burn it down, we don't start from the Garden of Eden, we start from the ashes. And there are people who think that like you burn it down and literally we just like reset and you're like, hey, in the Garden of Eden, you're like, that's not it, right? And some people will get hurt in the ashes, right? And like that is real, so I worry about what that looks like. You know, when we say the system is broken and somebody says, well, it was designed to be that way, my takeaway from that is always that it was designed. And because people made it up, we can make something different. And like that to me is like the anchor of hope, right? That like, you know, if they can rewrite the tax code on scrap paper, then we can do all of this, right? Like this doesn't have to be like a 50-year or 2 generations. They literally rewrote like on scrap paper that nobody read. It's the biggest tax rewrite. That is wild, right? So don't tell me that it takes like 2 generations to end mass incarceration. Like, just give me scrap paper, right? Like that is how I think about this.
You know, we're sitting here in very privileged positions. People are here to listen to us. They hear us whether they want to or not in many instances. Hopefully you do. But there are a lot of Americans right now who are struggling. They're struggling on so many levels, and it's very difficult for them to see that there can be a change. And I guess what would each of you say to somebody who says, you know what, it's just not possible, we can't change it? And I know this is a conference about hope, but we also have to remember that not everybody has the ability to sit here and have a conversation like this and, you know, go into a really nice hotel room and, you know, think about the book that they're writing and things like that. Like, there are Americans who will never get to that point, and they're looking at this country and they're terrified. What do we say to them? Is there a message? Is there hope? Is there something that they can do to take away and feel like there is a possible change?
There's so many different answers, and I mean, I would say the first thing I would do is listen to them. I mean, you know, because listening is maybe the most revolutionary thing we can possibly do. But if just in the beginning we remember not to look up all the time, but look at each other, we'll be part of the way there. Because we all have you know, friends and people who trust us and adversaries and things we can do internally. And I think part of the despair comes from a case of the shoulds. You know, what should I do, as opposed to every day getting up and thinking, I'm going to do everything I can, and I'm going to speak the truth, and I'm going to reach out to anybody who needs me in the moment, and take it from the bottom up instead of the top down.
I'd say two things come to mind. One is that the status quo thrives on people not believing that they have power. Like, that is one of the ways that like we get into the musical chairs with the status quo instead of actually changing the room. Is that people, one of the beautiful things about the protests is that in city, all of a sudden you found people who were like, I got it, right? Like, I have power, I get it, I can shut this down, I can speak this truth. Like, you saw people all over the country realize that they could do something different, and they always had the power, they just didn't know. It makes me think about like teachers, is that what the best teachers do is that they walk into the classroom knowing that the gift existed before they got there, right? And part of their work is to help the gift exist long after they're gone. What the worst teachers do is say the gift only exists in my presence. And part of our work is to remind people that like the gift is already there. What I can do as an organizer, an activist, is like help you access the gift when I'm here and access it long after I'm gone. That is like what the best teachers do, the best activists, the best organizers. Like, that is part of the work. The second part is I do believe that we have to take the truth everywhere, and part of that work is just transformative. Like, telling the truth in spaces. I'll never forget, I got arrested in Baton Rouge. I was in jail for 17 hours. It's a long, awful time in Baton Rouge. And in Louisiana, when you get out of jail, the judge has to like give you the right to leave the state. And like, I don't live in Louisiana, so I get out of jail and then I still can't leave because she came out of church and didn't sign the box. So I'm like stuck in Louisiana. And then we have this meeting with Obama like 2 days later, right? So I finally get out of Louisiana, I like go home, I like barely am home, and then I'm at the White House. And people are like really excited to see him, and I like Obama, and you know, in this stage, he could be the king, you know, because you're like, whatever, right? So, but like Obama, but I walk in and I'm like, all I can think about is how 100 of us sat in jail for 2 days, right? So everybody is going around being like, thank you so much for the meeting. And I'm like, mad, you know? I'm like, President Obama, tell me what you can know about this. And when he finally talks, he's like, DeRay, well, and I'm like, yeah, well, what, right? Like, we got work to do. And part of our commitment in this space is to take the truth with us everywhere we go, regardless of who's at the table, like what positions, that like, the tension actually is the work. And I've seen too often that we get into rooms with people we respect and we love, and we forget that like our obligation is to take the truth and to know that we're not the only people that can take the truth. That part of our work is to also keep the door open and make sure as many people can come in the room as possible. So when I give people advice, it's like, you know that you have more power than you think. I think about being in the school system is that I used to manage all staffing, and this one parent one day, she emails and she's like, hey, my kid's classroom has 40 kids. It's like a first grade class. It's a lot of kids in first grade. And you know, we have 200 schools. I didn't hear that from a principal. I didn't hear from the teacher. I heard it from this random parent. Random parent emails the superintendent. Superintendent emails me. We literally redo the staffing in that elementary school because of this one random email. She'll never knew it was her email. She'll never know it was her email that changed the staffing in the school, but it was it, right? And part of that is like her believing that like her voice actually mattered in some way. And like I think that has to be a part of how we think about this.
How do we sustain movements? Black Lives Matter and a lot of the movement that came out of Ferguson is now 5 years later. We're 5 years after Ferguson. Feminism has had four?
August 2014. August 2014 was
2014,
yeah.
but 5 years after Trayvon, right?
5 years after Trayvon.
So, and feminism has had multiple waves and so has the broader fight for civil rights. I remember a dark time in the 90s when feminism and civil rights were sort of not the issue in college campuses, unlike today. How do you sustain interest in a movement? I remember, telling someone in college, well, there's a Center for Women's Concerns, and there was a joke about what women were concerned about, right, at the time. And yet today, every young woman that I know is proudly calling herself a feminist. And even going beyond that. And there's been this real embrace of Black Lives Matter and other civil rights politics. I wonder if we're going to see this level of sustained engagement, or will we have is this just an ebb and flow of movement building?
Well, part of it is that we need to be understandable to each other. I'm listening to you and I'm thinking, okay, this is why we need to listen to your podcast. You are completely understandable and inspirational, is he not? Okay. This is the reason we need to buy his book, right?
We like her.
But also we just have to. I think what helps us is to see the connections among all these things, right? All the movements and our aspirations are totally all connected. Trayvon Martin, okay. Zimmerman had been abusing women and had been convicted of abusing women before. If he had been interrupted in this habit, it might have been different. As it was, even in his trial for murdering Trayvon Martin, that evidence was not admitted. So it's just an example of how these things are connected, that actually violence in the household, violence against females usually, but sometimes against men, certainly violence against kids, is the biggest predictor of all other violence, but we don't connect it. Our police force, for instance, has in general, police families have 4 times the rate of domestic violence that families in general have. If we address that, not to get rid of these guys, but to treat it, to understand it, to stop it, there would not be so much racist police violence either. These things are connected.
In general, I think about like the movement has to grow as people grow, and vice versa, that has to be a part of the work. There was a point in my life where I literally I drove to Ferguson, didn't know anybody in the street. The first thing I ever did was make these amazing sandwiches in somebody's living room. Like, I quit my job, slept in the car on the side of the road, like all these things. And that was a point in my life where I was like, I could do it. I was ready to do that in that way. And now I'm in the world differently, and like the movement, there should still be place for all of us as we grow. So I think that is a part of it. The second thing, and I'm more convinced about this now because people ask me all the time, like, what am I doing to talk to the Trump voters, right? They're like, well, what are you doing to reach across the aisle? And I say to people like,
That was my next question.
see, I got you. Is that I'm trying to build the biggest choir. I'm all about not even just preaching to the choir, but building the biggest one. Because I know the choir needs to go to rehearsal, the choir needs to learn new music, and that there are a lot of people who are just waiting for an invitation, right? So part of our work is to like sing the best songs so that more people come to the choir. I believe that there are more people who want to join the choir than are in the choir today. And there's so many people who literally just want the invitation. So being in the choir is not like a stagnant piece of the work. Like that in the choir, if y'all have ever been in a church choir, it's more rehearsals than you've ever been to. You know, it's like, I feel like the church choir rehearse more than anything. But like that is a part of the work. It's like, how do you actually like make sure that you're giving new music, that the choir is like the strongest and biggest thing that you have. I believe that there are more of us than them. I think that is true. And you know, Cleo Wade, who's a mutual friend of both of ours, she always talks about activism as just organized storytelling. And part of what we have to do is like tell the story in a way that mobilizes people and creates on-ramps and off-ramps. It's why when I talk about the police, I believe we can live in a world without the police. I know that some people, that's just not the way to enter into the conversation with them. They're like, if I start there, people are like, they're like, people get killed. And you're like, yes, but the police actually aren't solving those murders either. So like, but what I say to them, I'll say things like, you know, in California, there's a law that literally says that any investigation of an officer that lasts more than a year can never result in discipline, regardless of the outcome. You can love the police and think that doesn't make sense, right? In Cleveland, the rule says that all officer disciplinary records are destroyed every 2 years. You can love the police, and that don't make sense, right? That like in Maryland, the law says, it literally says, there's this whole problem with can you file anonymous complaints against the police all across the country. So when Alton Sterling got killed in Baton Rouge, police chief gets on TV and he says, if you have a complaint, please call us and file it. The secret in Baton Rouge is that you actually can't call in complaints against the police. You can't call them in, like you have to sign a paper, which is like, why did you tell people to call? But in Maryland, the law literally says you can file an anonymous complaint against for everything except brutality. That is what the law says. So it's like, you can love the police, and that just don't make sense, right? So, and I say that because that is me trying to think about like, how do I create space for you in the work? Like I'm trying to get you here. I'm trying to create an on-ramp and an entrance for you to join this team, knowing that I'm trying to get you at the end to say that we might not need it to look like this, that 100 years ago we were slitting people's wrists and letting them bleed out and calling that healthcare, and that was not a good solution. And I think that we're in a similar place with how we think about safety and policing today. But I get that like part of the choir is like finding like that hymn that people can hum first so they can learn how to sing later.
But how do you how do you convince people to come across the aisle, to join the choir, when a lot of the media narrative, as someone who works in media, has been, I'd say, there have been mixed results with how the media has covered it, and I'm being generous there. But how do you bring people into the choir when I think the narrative that we're seeing now is one of power, as you mentioned, Gloria? This is about, you know, the way that it's being presented, I think, by the current administration in particular, is that we're going to lose everything, right? It's a zero-sum game. So when you have people that are so afraid to lose whatever they think they might lose, how do you get past that with a movement that potentially threatens whatever they're thinking?
No, but before that, I want to endorse organizing the choir, okay? Because we need to remember that this guy lost by 6 million votes, okay? 3 for Hillary and 3 for other people. So, you know, we're talking about a third of the country here. And we need to organize our 2/3, our choir, right? And we fail to do that in a lot of cases. So we need to start there. And then empathy helps, and just looking at, I mean, for instance, 51% of white married women voted for Trump. And 96% of black women, married and unmarried, voted for Clinton. Okay, incidentally, this has been true of the women's movement from the beginning. It's always been disproportionately women of color, and especially black women. And, you know, I mean, some of us are writing a whole hidden figures of the world, you know, but anyway. So, you know, we need to look at the reality of the numbers, and then we need to think about why, you know. Well, these are, first of all, it isn't just that we live in a patriarchy or in a racist system, it's also that a patriarchy and racism lives in us, right? So these women are likely dependent on their husband's identity and income, and they're voting his interest. I'm oversimplifying here, obviously, because there are a lot of reasons, but so it always makes me think about Harriet Tubman, who said when congratulated and admired for freeing thousands of slaves by, you know, going into the South and bringing them out at night and so on, she always said, I could have freed thousands more if only they knew they were slaves. So it starts with consciousness, whoever we are, and getting the embedded ideas of inferiority or need for a structure that says that there is a hierarchy, and just because I'm white, I'm a, you know, and also sometimes, here's another thing that drives me crazy. We present this as a penalty somehow. You know, it's not a penalty. I mean, I think white people should sue this fucking system for being kept from knowing, you know, most people in the world, but, you know, I mean, it's such a deprivation, hello, you know, I mean, we present our solutions as medicinal instead of self-interested in the deepest sense and joyous.
I'd say, too, I don't spend much time reaching across the aisle to those people, partly because if you don't think that I'm, like, worthy of being alive, I don't know what the argument is. Like, I don't know what I'm going to say to you that suddenly convinces you that that's, like, a good thing, right? When I am in places, with that said, with people who are, like, interested in having a conversation, I try to, like I said earlier, I try to ask the hard question that has them do a lot of work. So I was with somebody recently, and he was like, DeRay, he's like, I get intersectionality. He's like, I think I get it, and I'm like, I support it, but I don't really understand it, right? It's like, okay. And, you know, like, it is a hard thing because some people think the intersectionality is about intersecting identities, and it is really about intersecting systems of oppression, which are two different things. And I said to him, he's a straight black guy, and I said to him, like, tell me the last time you felt unsafe. And he's like, okay, let me think about it. And then he pauses, and I say, tell me the last time you felt unsafe in your body. And he says, oh, when I was around the police. And I'm like, well, that's really interesting, because as a gay black man, I feel unsafe all the time. Like, I can think about a million scenarios that have nothing to do with the police where I feel unsafe, right? You ask a woman the last time they felt unsafe in their body, they can think about a million scenarios that don't actually involve the police, but, like, safety is, like, a real thing. Or, like, when's the last time you felt unsafe in your mind? And, like, this conversation, by the end, he was like, now I get how other people go through the world in a way that, like, is just not the way, I don't ever have to think about these things. And it was like, yes, right? Like, that is the purpose of it. And it took a little bit of work on my end to keep pushing and to keep prodding. But it was this thing about, like, I could give you a speech about it, but, like, you're gonna walk away and have done no work. I'm trying to get you to see, like, how other people live in the world and how they're intersecting, like, systems of oppression bear in on their lives every single day in a way that you just don't ever have to grapple with. And, like, that, I think, has to be how we create space for people who are interested in being the work and don't know how yet.
We've got 15 seconds left, so I want to give you both the opportunity to tell us, should we, well, I'm sure I know your answer, DeRay, but should we be hopeful, and what gives us cause to be hopeful right now?
Well, I know because of your podcast, even though we're just meeting for the first time today, that you too, like me, are a hopeaholic, right?
Hopeaholic.
Okay, so, because hope is a form of planning. You know, if your hopes weren't real inside you, you couldn't even hope them.
Right.
So to not to be hopeful is to be defeated immediately. It's that hope and vision of what could be even if it's 5 minutes from now, or if it's 5 years, or whatever it is, that gives us the strength to proceed toward it. So, do I know what's going to happen? No, I don't know what's going to happen. But hope is absolutely crucial. I would like to say that age segregation is just as bad as every other kind of segregation in a lot of ways. Because us old folks, okay, I'm 84 years old, so I get to say something. Us, we can bring hope because we remember when it was worse, okay? And we so need younger people because they are mad as hell because they know it should be better, right? So, it's just, hope is a vision of what you're going to do the next day and the next, and what this person might respond. And I'm all for hopeaholism, and I'm so grateful that both you're angry and you're hopeful. Thank you.
Thank you. And I'd say simply, I'm proud to be in a community of so many people who are ready to do something about the things in the world. And I think about being on the stage today, it's like, what does it mean to not live in somebody's shadow, but to live in their glow? And I think that is like the best of what we can do with each other.
Thank you both. And thank you. All right.
This is great. We're good.
So I always like to think in threes, so I'm going to pull 3 things out. Hope is a form of planning. We are all really good at planning, I know. Our job is to build the biggest choir that we can that is singing the best song. And that's all about building our community, and building our community that sings a song that everyone feels included. But the other image I want you to walk away with is the image of a scrap of paper. So DeRay said that, in fact, many of the newest tax law was written on a scrap of paper. In the green room, Bob Friedman and I were sitting with Gloria, and she goes, I have a scrap of paper. It's been in my wallet. And she pulls it out and has 3 of the most profound sayings you can imagine. So to me, it says to us that it is all of our scraps of paper written when we are feeling most like singing that is going to help to do the things we have all committed to do. Reduce the racial wealth divide in a generation. Create a financial system that serves people's truth and builds a community across every sector, every geography, every color that works for everyone who lives there. So I want to give several thank yous before I send you out in actually the last hot day we're going to have. I want to thank all of you for creating an experience over the last several days that was truly inspiring. Is Tony Corianaldi here? All right, stand up, Tony. So Tony came to me, asked for a picture, and I said, how was the conference for you? She's with Fund My Future and the Propel Schools in Pittsburgh, which is actually where my husband's from. And she said, I have so many things that I'm going to do the minute I get back into the office on Monday. That's exactly what I want everybody to be saying on your scraps of paper. So thank you, Tony, for that inspiration. I want to thank all of our sponsors, starting with Wells Fargo, who helped us close this conference up so beautifully. but the other 36 sponsors who made this all possible. I want to thank our youth council who've been with us the whole time. Would you all stand up? All the youth who've been part of this, all right? And last but never least, I want to thank the Prosperity Now staff and board of directors who have been with us all 3 days. Thank you again for an extraordinary job. I said last night at an event that everybody's been coming up to me, and thank you for that, to say how exciting and wonderful the event was. But before they finish that sentence, they don't even have a comma. They say, and your staff has been amazing. And that is such an extraordinary thing to hear. And I just am so grateful. I don't even know how to say thank you for that. So let's go. Let's address wealth inequality together and fix democracy while we're at it. Thank you all.